Hi everybody, and welcome to this Praxical Live Science Seminar. Today we're going to be focusing on our Conserving Endangered Species workshop and talking to some of the scientists who helped us create this workshop so you can know a bit more about the science that they do, and as well as learn about the workshops and what you can do to help preserve endangered species in Australia. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respects to the Bedigal people who are the traditional custodians of the land in which these workshops were created and which I am at today at UNSW in Sydney. We're very privileged today to have an amazing ecologist with us from the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, and her name is Dr. Sarah Bell. So she is an ecologist with the DPIE, and she spends all her time going out into the bush and trying to figure out how to preserve endangered species, study them, try and count their numbers and see what we can do to preserve them and protect them. So without further ado, I'm going to send through Sarah Bell and you can ask her all your questions after she gives you a little 5-minute introduction to what she does.
Hi everyone, thanks for the introduction. Yeah, so my name's Sarah. I work as a Senior Project Officer in the Saving Our Species program. You might wonder what that involves. So I'm based in Dubbo, so the region of New South Wales I look after is northwest. So we go from Bathurst, Lithgow area right out to the western border and then right north as well. So we cover about 60% of the state. So when I started, I got a list of threatened species that I'm responsible for. There were 26 species on that list and only 6 of them I actually do in-depth projects on. So one being the Regent Honeyeater, which takes up most of my time because there's a lot of attention, a lot of interest, and it's critically endangered. So there's lots of things we can do to try and recover the species. Some of the other species I work on are the yellow-footed rock wallaby, which is out west, a couple hours north of Broken Hill. The red-lord whistler, which is another woodland bird species, which is down near Lake Cargelligo. The purple copper butterfly, which is around Bathurst Lithgow area. And I also have a Eucalyptus alligatrix, subspecies alligatrix, which is in Rylestone. I don't know if you know where that area is, but it's just sort of west of the Blue Mountains. It's just a eucalypt that occurs on one property. There's about 3,000 trees there, and that's the only place anywhere in the world that this species actually grows. And I also have a couple little shrubs that I do work on. So I guess the thing I like most about my job is the variety. One day I can be out looking for a bird. Next day I'm out doing an aerial survey from a helicopter for a rock wallaby. The next day I could be out counting leaves on a plant or looking at how much ground cover there might be around that plant or trying to assess what the threats are at a site. So it certainly kept me busy, and it's let me be able to see a lot of places throughout New South Wales and see all these wonderful natural areas we have and all this biodiversity that we have that most people probably aren't aware of. One of the lesser known species that I work on is a species called Nitella partita, and it is a threatened algae. Before I started this job, I didn't even know that threatened algae exist. And so that was quite an interesting one. It's out west in the Peru catchment area. Yeah, so that's a little bit about my job. For the Regent Honeyeater, I coordinate all Regent Honeyeater recovery actions in New South Wales area. I work with so many partners on the Regent Honeyeater, including Taronga Zoo, BirdLife Australia, the local land services, the Environmental Trust, Biodiversity Conservation Trust. There's so many partners, and I guess it's such a large recovery effort involved in recovering this species that so many partners are involved, and I think that's one of the real successes of the program is that everyone has their bit to play, and if it was just left up to one organisation then we'd never get anywhere with it. So hopefully we're really making a dent in seeing that upward trajectory in the species.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for that introduction. So the way this seminar is going to work is that it's all about you getting an opportunity to talk to these scientists and ask them these questions, to talk to Sarah and learn a bit more about what she does. So we have 2 different ways the questions are coming in. The first ones are from our Google Forms. So people have been submitting questions over the last few days while they've been doing the workshops, and we've got them all together, and we'll be sort of leaking them out to you over the seminar. There's also an opportunity for you to ask questions live. So either your teacher in the room, or if you're listening to this by yourself, you can click on the Q&A button, which is in the top right hand of your corner, It looks like a little question mark and 2 chat boxes. And from there, you can ask questions to Sarah directly. So Bonnie, who's been helping us with these workshops, she's posted a few already, which have come in from that Google form. And the first one for you, Sarah, is how do you become an ecologist? What did you do to get to where you are today? So I'll let you answer that one if you don't mind.
Certainly. So I had a bit of a convoluted route to becoming an ecologist. I went to university and I did a science degree. From that, I was looking at maybe getting into medicine at first, and I ended up doing a research project on the squirrel glider. Sort of, most people might not have heard of this species. It's very similar to a sugar glider, but it's another threatened species and slightly larger, called a squirrel glider. And I was looking at the physiological biomedical side of things in the aspect of this research project. But what I found when I was doing this work is that I just became really interested in the ecology of things and how everything interacts in the environment and why certain species do certain things and certain populations act in certain ways. And it just got so many questions going in my head that I ended up doing an honours research project on the ecology of the squirrel glider. So I abandoned the medicine idea and went down this track. And I started looking at one island population off the coast of Brisbane on South Stradbroke Island. And I was looking at how isolation on an island has affected this species over a long time. And there's very few predators on islands, not as many competitors as well. So you get a whole range of these really interesting, peculiar characteristics come up. And I found out all this really interesting stuff going on there. And I just had even more questions to answer. So I then went on and did a PhD on the squirrel glider. And I expanded my study to look at 7 islands in southeast Queensland and a few mainland sites to really understand if it was a consistent changes seen in these populations on islands, or whether it was just a once-off for that one South Stradbroke Island population. So I guess I did a science degree. I went on and did research. Then I ended up getting a job in Brisbane City Council working on invasive species, so trying to come up with strategies for where you should manage pest species to get the best biodiversity outcome. I did that for about 5 years, and now I'm in this current role. So I've been doing this for about 4 years now, and so there's 1 year left on the program, so it'll be exciting to see what happens, whether the program gets extended and I can stay on in this role, or whether there'll be some new exciting fauna or flora to get into and learn all about and do things for.
That's amazing, Sarah. Thank you. So there was quite a lot of interest in regards to the Regent honeyeater, which was the bird that was studied in the workshops. One particular question was, why did our honeyeaters like mistletoe rather than any other plants? Or do they like lots of different blossoms and the mistletoe is just one that's easily accessible to them? There's students and people who are involved in the workshops. They had a lot of involvement in mapping using GIS, trying to figure out the layers of mistletoe and how they can map those populations, the abundance of that mistletoe, to try and work out the best habitat for the Regent honeyeater. I'm wondering if you go into a little more detail about that mistletoe and why it's such a important species for the Regent honeyeater.
Yeah, well, I guess it's just like us humans, we all have our own taste for things. I might like bananas more than apples, and I think that's exactly the same for mistletoe over other species. So it's the same with the eucalypts. So they really like the mugger iron bark, the yellow box and white box, but there's a whole suite of other eucalypts that they'll eat if there's nothing else around flowering, but it's certainly not their preference. So I guess it's to do with that. I'm not exactly sure what the constitution of the nectar product is, but there must be something in it that they particularly like. For instance, one of the tree species that they do love to get nectar from is the mugger ironbark. And we've been working with these sentinel beehives to give us an idea of what's happening in the environment, to give us an idea of what Regent honeyeaters might be doing. And talking and learning more about the apiary industry, we found out that bees do not like mugger at all, because there's no pollen or protein content in that nectar source. So if you have bees in an area that just have mugger ironbark flowering, they won't actually survive. So I think it must be to do with the combination of pollen, which is a protein source, as well as the nectar, which is a sugar source. The other good thing about mistletoe is that it generally flowers a lot more frequently than eucalypts do. It's a little bit more reliable. Eucalypts, it's really dependent on rain falling at the right time when the eucalypt buds are developing. And then you need rain to fall at the right time for it to actually produce nectar as well. And not a lot of eucalypts flower every year. Some flower every second year, some flower every 3 to 4 years, 5 years. So it's a little bit less reliable, whereas mistletoe is a much more reliable species. So I guess regent honeyeaters favour areas where there is mistletoe because they can be assured that there'll be food for them.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Sarah. One question came in from Veer, and they were asking about edge effects. So just to go over it again for everyone who hasn't completed a workshop yet, we really studied edge effects in the workshop because as you fragment up the bushland, as you put roads through it, or you have a perfect patch of national park, and as you put roads through it, or as you fragment it up, you can actually degrade the value of that bushland because those edges let lots of invasive species get in. It can change the nature of that bushland greatly. Viv asked the question, Veer asked the question, if edge effects aren't much suitable for animals, why does it work in zoos? Why can you have zoos? I'm imagining they have these small compartments with edges around them. How is that still suitable for animals to live in? So I'll let you talk a bit about edge effects, Sarah, if you don't mind, and answer how that goes into maybe animals in zoos.
Yeah, certainly. So I looked into a lot of edge effects when I did my squirrel glider research, actually. I was looking at different sorts of edges. So whether a road edge was worse than a residential edge versus a open field edge. And it was really quite interesting to look at the stress levels of the animals that were on the edge and the different levels of stress. So we found that the road was a worse edge than the residential versus an open field, which is sort of what you'd expect, but it was neat to come up with that example. The other thing that we found out with those edges as well is that with squirrel gliders, you could tell whether an animal was dominant or not. The males had this bald patch on the top of their head, and what they would do is that they would rub it on the females in their little colony if they're trying to say that, oh, you're my girlfriend. And the more they rubbed their scent gland on these females to give their smell onto them, the balder they would get. So you could actually see how dominant a male was by the size of his bald patch. And we found that the more dominant males were in the nice interior parts of the bush, but the edge had all the juveniles. So it was obviously the less optimal habitat. They would get kicked out and pushed to the edge because they weren't as dominant, weren't as strong as those really dominant squirrel gliders. So I guess it's the same thing would be for regent honeyeaters. A lot of those edges, one of the primary threats that comes about from edges is noisy miners, which are one of the biggest competitors to regent honeyeaters and is one of the major threats that they face. And they prevent a lot of nesting from happening, and they just love that open habitat that they can get into and really compete for any nectar resources on those edges. So yeah, so edges aren't good. I think why it works in a zoo is that the animals kept in a zoo aren't wild. They're supplemented with food. So I guess if they were left to their own devices, it wouldn't be optimal to have these edges in the zoo. But because they are supported with food and supplementation of water, and there's usually in zoos they usually avoid competition as well. So in the captive breeding program that we have for regent honeyeaters, they don't normally house males together because there's too much competition. So I guess it doesn't really matter if you have edges because they've modified the way they're looking after the animals to make sure that that isn't a threat to them.
No, thank you, Sarah. That was really insightful. We have a question now from Hugh, and they're asking, what difficulties do you experience while studying endangered species? Is it a lot harder to find them? Is it more dangerous, or do you have to go to more remote places to track them down? What are some of the interesting experiences that you get, some of the difficulties that you get from studying these endangered species?
I think the difficulty is finding them. You've got it right. You can go for, I've known people who've done a PhD on a critically endangered species, and they've seen 2 of them for the whole 3 years that they've been researching this species. And I guess that's the most disheartening thing. And it's about, I think that it's also like a good challenge to face as well, like how you do go about finding them. And because that's one of the first steps when you look at threatened species management, is trying to work out how many you have, what's the population doing, is it going up, is it going down? So I guess it's just a challenge to not only like to adopt new strategies to work out how to go about getting that baseline population level. So for one of my species I work on, the red-lord whistler, it's a cryptic bird. I think I've been working on it for nearly 4 years now. I've probably seen only about 4 of them in that time. And so getting any idea of the population size is impossible if you're just doing it by looking for them. So what I've actually done is I designed this survey methodology where I use these acoustic recorders, and I set up the acoustic recorders across the area where they occur. There's one every 3 kilometres, and I set them up just to record the noises that are in the environment. And then at the end of, I have them up for about a 3-month period. At the end of that 3-month period, I pull them in. And what I've done is there's software around called Kaleidoscope, and you can actually program the software to identify, this is what a red-lord whistler call sounds like. And so I've identified the software program. I run it against all the sound files that I brought in from the field, and it will pull out exactly where all the red-lord whistlers are. So it's a really neat way to actually be able to be monitoring a species that is cryptic, a little bit shy, is not going to come out and show you where they are while you're there. So it's a way to be able to monitor it with little effort, putting them out there for a few months, bring them in, and then you can record exactly where your red-lord whistlers are. So last year I had 30 song meter stations for the red-lord whistler, and 15 of them actually had red-lord whistlers within the vicinity of them. So it's a really cool way. If we keep doing that over a year, subsequent years, we should be able to get an idea of whether the population is going up or going down based on how many of these song meter stations are recording red-lord whistlers in proximity.
That's great. Thank you, Sarah. We have another great question from Veer coming in all around the mistletoe. For those who want a bit of a refresher, we studied the mistletoe, and there was a important difference we had to make between the mistletoe that you may be familiar with in your Christmas TV shows, you know, the kind of those pointy leaf ones with those red berries that hang on doorways and that kind of stuff, compared to the native Australian mistletoe. So in relation to that, Veer was asking, what is the difference between Australian and other mistletoe? Would it be vastly different in taste? I'm assuming for the birds, but maybe for people as well. And then the question goes on, if not, would it be a suitable idea to import mistletoe in the areas of little amounts of mistletoe, despite their low elevation, but with a certain concentration of mistletoe species? So could you introduce other types of mistletoe, or do so something similar to boost the amount of food available to the region honeyeaters?
I definitely think there's value in that. Mistletoe certainly isn't my area of expertise, so definitely not an expert in them, but I know there are a large number of mistletoes out, native Australian mistletoes, and the regent honeyeater would only prefer a few of those as well. So it's all about making sure you target the right mistletoe to attract regent honeyeaters into areas. So one of the projects we were looking at doing is exactly that. So with the bushfires that occurred over December, January, we were quite concerned about the amount of habitat that's been lost from that, especially foraging habitat for regent honeyeaters. And one of the activities that we've submitted a funding application for is to reintroduce some needle leaf mistletoe, which is the mistletoe that is on the casuarina. So I don't know if you've seen the long, skinny casuarina leaves. It mimics that in its leaf, so it almost looks like it's part of the tree, but it's an actual mistletoe. So we're looking at reintroducing that to areas of the Kapiti Valley area, where it used to occur previously in quite large numbers, but it's had dieback. We figured because of the fire and the extreme amount of habitat loss, if we can do some of these reintroductions, there's only benefits to gain. It's quite interesting though. Once again, I've been doing a lot of work with the bees to monitor nectar flow for the regent honeyeater, and some of the apiarists that I've met through them are really opposed to mistletoes, and they will actually see mistletoe on a tree and actually chop the mistletoe off the tree because they think it's degrading or reducing the viability of that tree. So I guess it's also about managing the perception as well, making sure that we're not upsetting people with what we do, educating people. Mistletoe can be, it looks like if you go into an area where there's trees that are really stressed, they can be overburdened burdened with mistletoe, which can be a detriment to the tree as well. So it's about making sure you apply it in the right circumstance.
No, that's great. Thanks, Sarah. Just a question that I'm personally interested in was you mentioned that you may be trying to reseed mistletoe in these areas where there may be damage from fires and stuff. In the workshop, we touched on the idea that the mistletoe is spread by seeds sticking to the feet of birds and they're getting sort of pulled around on trees. How will you go about reseeding this mistletoe? Will you be personally going after seeds and sticking them on trees, or how will you go about that?
Yeah, so the BirdLife Australia and local land services have been doing that reseeding of mistletoe. So what they do is they collect fresh fruit from the mistletoe, and then they'll engage an arborist or a tree climber to actually go and climb the tree to put the fruit. I'm not too sure exactly how they treat it, because you think they would need to somehow replicate the digestive process of the mistletoe bird, but they must do something with it to make it in a form that can stick it to a tree and it survive.
Wow, that's fascinating. Well, I learned a lot today, so that was great. We have another question coming in from Joseph, and they are asking, what are some of the natural reasons do species become endangered? Do you believe that obstructing with the tree's natural reasons is wrong and ethical on a moral ground?
Sorry, can you repeat that second part of that question again?
Butchered that one a bit, so I'm sorry. So the question is, what are some of the natural reasons that species become endangered? Do you believe that obstructing with these natural reasons is wrong on an ethical and moral ground?
That's a full-on question. I think it is. The example I think of is, so I did my PhD research on the squirrel glider, which is a threatened species. So one of the big issues for the regent honeyeater is that you get a lot of egg predation, and they've got footage in Victoria of squirrel gliders taking regent honeyeater eggs. So there's often this idea that, oh, maybe we should be culling squirrel gliders in the areas where regent honeyeaters are nesting to improve nest success. And that is it's a natural thing. So like we already do noisy miner control. So noisy miners are a native bird, but they're a really big competitor for regent honeyeaters. And it's a tough question. It's like, how far do you go to conserve a species? And it's something that it's not a question I have to answer myself. I'm glad that there's a big group of people, a national recovery team, that can address these ethical issues and come up with ways forward. But it's how far do you want to go? Like, do we want to be managing regent honeyeaters in areas at the detriment to all the other biodiversity within that area, just to make sure that we have nests survive? Or should we be instead maybe trying to focus on some of the other ways instead of managing that natural process in the environment? Maybe it's all about the population supplementations we've been doing with the captive bred releases. If we can increase the numbers of regent honeyeaters, maybe that little bit of predation by squirrel gliders or that little bit of competition from noisy miners won't have the same effect, because we've got so many out there forming big flocks. They can like build together and keep those predators away, or the odd loss of predation is not going to have a really large effect on the population overall. So I haven't really answered that question, but I guess it's just something we have to face every day, I guess. How far do you go? Like, it's not just about the one species, it's about everything. And we do tackle it in a range of other species. So for the red-lord whistler, for instance, one of the big threats there is fire, and making sure that we have the right age mallee in the environment. So mallee is a eucalypt, and the red-lord whistlers are reliant on it, and they prefer mallee of a certain age. So it's like, oh, maybe we should do a fire regime to create that age mallee across the area to be of benefit to the red-lord whistler. But one of my other colleagues works on mallee fowl, and the mallee fowl live in the same area, but they don't like the mallee of that age. They like it a lot older. But if you get it a lot older, the red-lord whistlers don't like it at that age. So I guess it's just about trying to balance the outcomes, not just thinking of one species, but thinking of the whole ecosystem.
No, definitely. And I think you touched on a really good point there, Sarah, all around how it's not up to one single person, no matter how smart you might be, to answer these kind of questions for all of Australian wildlife. You have teams of scientists and lots of people coming together to make these decisions and to think about these things from all different angles. And that's the real benefit of what science does. It's a scientific community coming together and having those debates and those discussions. We've got another question coming in from Grace, and they're asking, what other technology, aside from GIS mapping, do you use to investigate the Regent honeyeater?
Ooh, other technology. Well, I guess something that we're looking at doing soon is, well, something that we do currently for the captive breeding and release program. So I don't know if everyone's aware, but we just did a release, the first release in New South Wales in late June into the Lower Hunter area. And so we had 20 birds that were bred at the zoo and we released them into the wild. Half of 13 of those birds were fitted with transmitters, so VHF transmitters. So that's another type of technology we use. And if we have a receiver, you can detect that bird if it's within probably about 5 kilometres of you. So it's given us a way to use technology to be able to keep track of where the birds are, look at their survival, look at what they're doing, if they're breeding, what's happening in that regard. One of the things that has been on the cards for quite some time is to actually, the negative of that monitoring is that you have to be within close proximity to the bird to pick up a signal of it and then to be able to track down to find its exact location. There's another type of transmitter out there called a satellite transmitter, and it pings to the satellites. So if you put one of these on a Regent honeyeater, you can be sitting at home on your computer and you can log in and be like, oh, this Regent honeyeater is in the Blue Mountains at the moment at this location. Or the next day you could look in and, oh, it's over here at this location. So it will be such a game changer for Regent honeyeater recovery. And that it's been on the cards for a while. The issue is that the technology isn't quite light enough to fit on a Regent honeyeater, be it the weight capacity that a Regent honeyeater can carry. So we haven't been able to use them yet, but we're hoping at the end of this year. We're just receiving some which are expected to be a lot lighter, and we should be able to use them. And it's going to just open up so many interesting, probably more questions to be answered, because I don't know if you're aware that with the Regent honeyeater monitoring we do, usually come December, January at the end of breeding time, all the Regent honeyeaters we've been monitoring in the breeding areas just disappear, and then we don't see them again until April or May. So who knows where they go in those 5 months of the year? Is there something that's really threatening them in that location? We just have absolutely no idea. So the use of these satellite transmitters is going to be just mind-changing for our recovery. Who knows, maybe it might be really boring. Maybe they all split up and go in different places and hang out by themselves, or it might not be helpful, but it'll be a really interesting use of technology to answer some interesting questions on Regent honeyeater.
No, thank you, Sarah. And I will note another piece of technology that Emily, who was the ecologist in BirdLife Australia, she had with us out in the bush when we were doing some filming, was a callback audio player.
Oh, yep.
Do you want to talk about that a bit? Because I was really amazed that she had this thing and it works so well. So yeah.
Yeah, so it's a common way of doing surveys for birds. So often when you're looking for birds, they can be quite hard to see, especially if a bird's sitting quietly up in a tree in front of you. So one of the techniques that we use to actually have a higher chance of seeing a bird if it's in an area is playing the call of the bird. And if you play the call of the bird, especially around breeding time, any other birds in the area might get territorial, thinking, oh, there's some other male in my territory I've got to kick out, or maybe, oh, there's a female calling over there, let's go check it out. So you'll often find that birds will come into when you actually play a bird, so you've got a higher chance of seeing the bird. But I guess it's also something that you've got to use a little bit minimally as well. One of the concerns that we have for the Regent honeyeater is that in some areas are quite easily accessible. And because it's a critically endangered species, there's hardly any of them left in the wild. And you've got a lot of bird watchers out there who are dying to tick off every single bird species in Australia. You will often, when you have a Regent honeyeater sighting, you'll have lots of people flocking to that site to try and see them. And it's something that could be a detriment to the species, because if a Regent honeyeater is trying to nest and you've got someone playing the call non-stop at the base of the nest to try and spot them, and then they use up a lot of their energy, and they might end up abandoning that nest and moving to another spot, or or just it could also open them up to predation as well. So it's a really useful technology to finding them, but you've got to also make sure you use it sparingly to make sure that you're not having a detrimental effect to the species. I should also mention as well, back to my glider work, just not to be so bird focused, I'll add a few mammal stuff in. So there's another species of glider called a yellow-bellied glider. And one of the interesting ways of surveying for the yellow-bellied glider is to play a powerful owl call. So a powerful owl is its main predator. And if you play the call, you'll get yellow-bellieds coming in, like creating a raucous with their call, trying to show the powerful owl, there's lots of us here. We can protect our area, defend our area. And so it actually works on other species, but not but cross from bird to mammal. So that's another interesting little fact.
No, that's so fascinating, Sarah, because when we went out to the bush of Emily, she had this, it was like a music speaker on her belt, you know, we're like, oh, you're going to play some music or something, but she was like, no, it's actually a part of the research and they use it really, really efficiently. So we have another question coming in from Lohif, and they are asking, are there more regent honey eaters in captivity or in the wild? Especially noting that the bushfires during the early 2020 could have had greatly reduced the population like it did with koalas. Yeah,
well, I think the latest captive breeding figures are around about the 120 bird mark. So that's 120 regent honeyeaters in captivity. The majority of them are at Taronga, but there's a number of other institutions that participate in captive breeding as well across Australia. So I guess the question is, are there more than 120 regent honeyeaters in the wild? And that is such a challenging question. The current population estimate is 350 to 400 birds left in the wild, but the ability to track these birds or monitor them is impossible. Like they cover an area from the southern parts of Queensland right down to the northern part of Victoria, and you're not going to find them in the same place at the same time of year, or they move around depending on nectar resources. There's so few of them left in the wild that they could easily go undetected and just like be somewhere that no one sees them and then not recorded. So it's a really challenging thing to know exactly what the true population estimate is and what effect the fires and the drought has had on the species. It's not going to be until we have a good season, which might be next year, that we'll get some better figures on the number of regent honeyeaters to get more of an indication of what the population trajectory is doing, whether it's going up or down or still maintaining.
No, that's great. I'm just curious, why would next year be a better season? Why are you so optimistic about birds then?
I just, so the main areas that I work in are Kapiti Valley and the Mudgee-Walla area. And so probably the majority of breeding occurs in that area. So it's the easiest way to find regent honeyeaters is when they're breeding. So we get the majority of records from those areas. This year, none of the eucalypts, the key eucalypts, so the white box, the yellow box, or the mugger ironbark are in bud. So that means that none of them will be flowering this year. And it was because of the drought. We didn't have rainfall over that December, January, February period for the trees to put new bud on so that they could flower this year. And so they've missed out on that chance to flower this year. But I think, so it's not good for this year, but all the trees are having a rest this year. And a lot of these eucalypts will flower every other year. So if they're all having a rest this year, I feel that if we have rain at the right time this coming December, January, February, then they're going to there's going to be a large majority of them with bud on for next year. And if we get rain at the right time next year, there'll be lots of nectar flowing. And I just feel like it's going to be a really good year for regent honeyeaters, but I could be proven wrong.
No, it's good to hear you're optimistic, and it sounds like it's good reason to be optimistic. So that's great. We have another question from Veer coming in, and they're asking, what type of adaptations does the regent honeyeater have to help them gathering mistletoe and protecting themselves from species such as the noisy miner bird?
Oh, that's a tough question. So adaptations. I know that like most honeyeaters, they have the little feathery brush tongue tip, which can be useful for nectar gathering. I don't know if that's particularly useful for nectar from mistletoe though. In terms of the adaptations for noisy miners and defending themselves from them. I'd say they don't have any adaptations. That's why they're really suffering from the threat from this species. But it'd be great if they could get some adaptations to it. Maybe over time, we're going to be, with natural genetic selection, maybe we will get some regent honeyeaters that are more able to compete against noisy miners. But that would be an ideal world if that happened. I think it's up to us, I guess, to just make sure that we're managing that threat. So controlling noisy miners in areas and making sure that areas aren't suitable for noisy miners, in terms of making sure that we keep like a nice good ground understory, a nice mid-story, making sure there's lots of complexity in the environment, which noisy miners don't particularly like, but regent honeyeaters do like.
No, that's great. We have one question coming in from Dennis, and they're asking, what is your main goal for the year for helping the regent honeyeaters?
My main one goal this year has been the release of the captive bred birds into New South Wales. It's been a big goal, because when I first started 4 years ago, I went to the Victorian release within a few months of me commencing, and I saw 101 birds get released into the environment, 101 critically endangered regent honeyeaters. It was the first time I'd seen a regent honeyeater, and it was just so good to see, like, actually making an impact on a species and increasing the population so suddenly and so quickly. And I knew then that the next release was going to be in New South Wales. So it was just really exciting, because it's been building up for 3 or 4 years, just lining up, planning for this release. And it was meant to go ahead last year. And so I've been working on it nonstop put probably a good solid 6 months into planning for it, just leading up to the release last year. And everything was looking good. Trees were all budded up. There was flowers everywhere. There was white box, yellow box, mugger, the Blakeleys were all flowering. It looked fantastic. But the issue was that there hadn't been any rainfall, so there wasn't any nectar coming out of those flowers. So it looked like it was flowering, it looked fantastic, but there wasn't any nectar being produced, which we could confirm from our sentinel beehives that we had around. We had all these trees flowering around the beehive, but the beehives weren't bringing in any honey because there wasn't any nectar in the environment. So it was really quite interesting. So it was a bit of a disappointment to not be able to proceed, because we didn't want to release birds into an environment where they wouldn't survive. So we had to defer it. So it's been a big task. We'd sort of ruled it out for this year with the fires and the drought and the lack of bud. We thought there's no chance that there's going to be a suitable site this year for a release, but we knew that it was such an essential recovery action, because that small population size is one of the key issues for this species. And I think it was come sort of mid-April, one of the ecologists from BirdLife, Mick Roderick, was out in the Lower Hunter and noticed all these trees flowering unexpectedly. And we're like, oh, can we do this release? Something that we were planned for 6 months before, like the year before. Can we do that 6 months of planning in 6 weeks and get this release done? And we thought, yes, we've got to make the most of this opportunity. It's a critically endangered species. We can't let these chances pass. So we all just stopped all the work we were doing, focused on this, and got this release happening. So, and it's not just about releasing birds, job done. It's about seeing how those birds survive, monitoring factors that might have resulted in some mortality, and trying to tweak our design for the next release so that we can get maximum survival. So that was, so that's underway. The monitoring is still ongoing at the moment. So that's probably one of the biggest achievements and biggest things that I had on my agenda for the regent honeyeater this year.
That sounds amazing, Sarah. Can you tell us a bit more about that release process? So where did these birds come from? Who bred them up? And how did you go about releasing them? How did it all work?
Yeah.
So yeah, and have some water. Yeah, amazing. You've been smashing out all these questions. So
yeah, so the birds, the release birds come from Taronga Zoo, so they've been bred in captivity. So every so often, we will have a permit in place to collect some wild birds. So the interesting fact about this last release that we had was that a number of birds were collected from this site. I think it was about 5 birds were collected from this site about 5 years ago. and as founding stock for the zoo. So they always like to bring in new wild birds into the zoo captive breeding program to just introduce new genetics to make sure it's quite diverse, the genetic diversity, and it's not inbred. So we're breeding these healthy, fit animals for release. Some wild animals were actually collected from this site a number of years ago. So all of the released birds would have been offspring from these founders. So the 20 birds that we released were bred from those 5 birds, plus probably other original founders from previous years. And so what we did was they're based at Taronga Zoo. With the 6-week lead up to the release, they have to go through these stringent quarantine procedures just to make sure that we're not introducing any diseases to the wild population. We want to make sure that we're have everything covered. So they go through these quarantine procedures to make sure they're healthy, they're not carrying any diseases. They get put in quarantine aviaries. We picked, there were 20 birds to be released. We wanted at least 10 of those birds to be females and 10 to be males. I guess the consideration was more at least 10 female because the wild population is male biased. So we didn't want to put more males out there than females because that would make the wild population even more male biased. So we picked these birds for a release. So from the 5 releases that have happened in Victoria, the Taronga have done a whole heap of analyses to look at what the best characteristics of released birds are to promote survival. They found that birds between certain ages, I think it's 6 months and 3 years, are the best age to have a good survival post-release. They've also found that birds that spend a lot of time in multi-species aviaries, where they compete with other birds, they have a higher chance of survival post-release. So with this 6-week turnaround, they quickly put all the birds for release in the multi-species aviary to give them some time in there. And then they carefully planned out the quarantine process to make sure that birds could be collected from there, quarantined with the shortest amount of time and kept in holding aviaries. And then they get transported out to the release site. So when they get transported to the release site, that on arrival, the 13 out of 20 birds were fitted with transmitters. So the little backpacks, they get put on their back. And so they either get a transmitter fitted or not, and then they get put into these tents. And the tents are pretty much just like a tent you would camp in, but they don't have the outside sort of hard tarpaulin-y edge. It's just all net. So they get put in these release tents and they stay there for a few days just to make sure that the transmitter's fitted properly. It's not inhibiting their movement. They get used to the environment, the temperature. They get over any stress involved with the travel out to the release site, and just get ready to get released. So usually 3 days after that, we early in the morning we open up half the tents and release half the birds out. And it's really just unzipping a tent and letting them come out on their own time. If it's raining, you can be waiting there for I think we waited about 4 hours on the second release date just for the birds to leave their cozy tents and head out into this rainy environment. And so we release the first half on day 3, and then we wait another 2 days to release the second half. And that just gives us time to make sure that those first half, there's no issues with the environment at all. Everything is on track to looking like it would be a successful release. And then after we do the release, so all the birds are gone. The Taronga Zoo guys pack up the tents, they pack up their accommodation. They've got to stay right next to these birds for the period of 7 days, just in case there's any issues. Like we don't want any foxes or cats to get into these tents while the released birds are there. They're very expensive to breed, so you don't want to risk losing one to any outside effect. And then once the Taronga Zoo guys leave, then we're off monitoring. And so the team have been out there monitoring. We've got 4 people out there monitoring every day. And so their job is just to locate every single bird each day. And they've been doing that for about 8 weeks now. And we'll probably have that continuing on as long as the transmitters stay on the birds. So at the moment, the transmitters last about 10 to 12 weeks. And once we lose the battery on them, it'll be really hard to find the birds unless they happen to stay in the last location that they were observed in, which is very unlikely. Yes, that's how the release occurs.
Wow, that's awesome. So then there's a whole bunch of people that their job is full-time just going out there every day with these radio trackers trying to pinpoint these birds.
Yeah.
Sounds fun. Yeah.
It's been very challenging. Some of the birds have been moving 30 kilometres in a day, so they've been chasing them around the environment, whereas I think the Victorian releases, they were really well behaved, just staying in the one national park, which was really easy for monitoring, but the tracking team are chasing them. They'll get a signal one morning over here, and then they'll lose the signal, and they'll drive around and they'll find the bird that afternoon 30 kilometres away to the west or something. So it's been really challenging for them to keep a track of where they are.
Wow, that's amazing. On that, Dennis just asked a question. What issues or problems did COVID-19 present with the release and the tracking now? Has there been any limitations on the work you've been able to do?
Definitely. So the plan was to replicate what they do in Victoria for this New South Wales release, and that is to use a really large volunteer workforce to help track birds, because it's a really good way. It's a really good community engagement initiative to get people involved. They can track these birds, they can be in the environment that these birds live in, they get to see one of these birds in real life with their eyes, and then they can get engaged and be interested in the conservation of these species. But with COVID, there was no chance of having volunteers involved. We had to have a minimal workforce, so essential personnel only. Even at the release events, usually we have quite a fanfare, and we'll invite any of the neighbouring landholders, anyone interested, come on down, let's watch these birds get released. We were limited to, I think at the time, the COVID restrictions were to a maximum group size of 10 people. So we just had to have essential personnel only. So it was really scaled back, and yeah, we weren't able to have that volunteer participation, which would have really helped with the awareness of the species. But even, I guess we were able to overcome a lot of other restrictions to even be able to go ahead with the release. So I think it was really good. We had a lot of risk assessment practices in place just to make sure that it was done safely. So the team of 4 people monitoring birds, they're not allowed to travel in cars together. There's lots of wiping down of cars and hands with sanitizer, making sure that equipment isn't shared. So we've got a lot of practices in place just to make sure that we are reducing any risk of COVID transmission, just in case something does happen, because it would be quite a detriment to the program to be able to not monitor these birds for a few weeks if we did have to put it on hold.
No, definitely. It sounds like you managed that really well. I'm tying into a point you made about the volunteers, and because we're wrapping up at the end of our seminar, I just wanted to ask the question of how can everyday people get involved in protecting endangered species, in particular the regent honeyeater or bird species? Is there ways that people can go out and do some citizen science or get involved in surveying or something like that? If people wanted to learn more, what could they do to be involved?
Yeah, so there's lots of opportunities usually for volunteers to be involved in our Saving Our Species program. I think with the current COVID restrictions though, I don't know whether that volunteer program is up on board again, but I'd keep an eye on that. That's just through our Saving Our Species page. Other things that you can do, one of the biggest things that is really good for the regent honeyeater and other woodland bird species is just records. We can't be across everywhere to monitor birds. And so if you see some trees flowering that you know are white box, yellow box, spotted gum, mugger, and you hear lots of honeyeaters around, go out with your binoculars, see if you can see a regent honeyeater there. Any extra sighting we can get is really useful information for the species. Other things that you can do is just like start in your backyard, like start recording the birds that are in your backyard. You could look at planting little shrubs in your backyard, things that might attract honeyeaters in, or small woodland birds. So there's lots of different ways that you can get involved. The other thing as well is we are planning more releases of regent honeyeaters in the future. So if people were interested in getting involved in that, hopefully if we do a release next year, we won't have the COVID restrictions, who knows, but hopefully that will be the case, and then we will be able to have as many volunteers helping as possible to keep track of birds. And it is a good way to help with us do the monitoring, because it is quite time consuming, and the more people we can have out there the better, because it makes it a much easier job to get done.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I remember talking to Emily, who's this ecologist from BirdLife Australia, who a lot of the attendees here would know because she was featured in the films and the videos in the workshops. And she said her whole career really started through volunteering, getting into bird watching as a young student and into university. So I think there's a real hope that if you start volunteering young, you may be able to learn the skills and get passionate enough and really have a whole career in ecology, which is very exciting.
Yeah, definitely. Bird watching is a really, it's a skill that takes years of practice to pick up. Like some of those guys from BirdLife, I haven't worked too much with Emily, but I've worked a lot with the other BirdLife people. But it's just amazing. You can walk through the bush with them and they'll be like, oh, that's a such and such, such and such, such and such, just by the bird calls. And it's really amazing. My birds aren't like, I'm not amazing on my birds. Like I know a regent honeyeater and I know a lot of other things, but I usually have to visualize it to be able to know exactly what the bird species is. So it's just amazing. And I think it to get to that level, I think it does just takes years of practice. So getting in now and volunteering and you'll just gradually pick it up over time. And that's certainly a skill that would be really beneficial to any future job prospects if this is the industry you're looking to get into.
Yeah, no, thank you, Sarah. We may just wrap it up there because I think everyone's put in all the questions they wanted to ask. We've went through all the Google survey questions. Is there anything else you'd like to finish up on, Sarah? Is there any other little take-home messages you want people to know about your job or about the regent honeyeater or species conservation more broadly?
Not that I can think of. I just thank you for the opportunity to talk to people about regent honeyeaters for however long it's been. It's just great. The more people that know about them, the better it will be for the species.
Yeah, definitely. We might just squeeze one more question in because one's just got it on the chat, and it's from Veer, and they asked a great question saying, what happens if the regent honeyeater and other species migrate into unprotected habitats due to the increased risk of predators in national parks? How will they remain protected?
Well, we have a lot of other programs. So I guess a lot of the region where the regent honeyeaters are located isn't protected land. A lot of it is private property. So it's all about just getting that awareness out there. We have a lot of other government programs that can get landholders on board, give them incentives to managing their land to be to have good outcomes for the regent honeyeater. So it's not the end of the world if they aren't located on national park. I guess it's all about getting that awareness out there so that people know that what they can do to conserve the species on their property as well.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Sarah. So unless there's any final questions that want to come through, I think that may be the end of this seminar. So thank you so much, and thank you for everyone who was listening, who participated in this. If you have any follow-up questions, we'll be having another seminar with Emily later on in the week, another 2 more seminars, so one during the day again and one in the evening. So if you do have any more questions, please put them through on the Google form and we can get them answered there as well. This seminar was recorded, so we will put that up online for anyone who's interested to watch that back again. And once again, thank you all for participating, and a big thanks to Sarah for taking up her time out of a busy day to be a part of this amazing seminar that she gave. So thank you all so much. See you later.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.